It's the last Tuesday of the month. And you probably know the drill. You get in your car with your prescription, or maybe you're just glued to your phone, calling pharmacy number one.
Right.
Out of stock.
Right.
You call pharmacy number two. We don't know when we're getting more. Pharmacy number three is just a busy signal. It's the pharmacy scramble. And it's a monthly ritual that millions of Americans are still performing right now in February 2026.
It is exhausting. And honestly, for a lot of people, it's just become the new normal.
Exactly. I mean, we are entering the fourth year of what everyone is just calling the Adderall shortage. It started way back in late 2022, and yet here we are. So the mission for today's deep dive isn't just a vent about empty pill bottles.
We've all done enough of that.
Yeah, we have. We really want to understand the machinery behind this. Like, why is it so hard to fix? So we're going to look at a stack of sources today. We've got current status reports from MedFinder and the Global Women's Network, but we're also digging into a really fascinating Reddit community investigation into DEA filings.
That one is so detailed.
It really is. And to wrap our heads around all this, we're looking at a historical analysis from the PMC about the first amphetamine epidemic from the 1940s, plus the actual text of the 1971 UN Convention on Psychotropic Substances.
And I think that history piece is crucial, honestly, because we tend to just look at supply chains and, manufacturing delays, which are definitely part of it. But to really understand why you cannot get your medication today, you have to look at international treaties from 1971 and literally the legacy of World War II.
Yeah.
Is this incredibly complex web of regulation that was actually designed to stop a completely different problem than the one we're facing right now.
So let's unpack this. Let's start with the ground truth. It is February 2026. What is the actual state of affairs? Like, is it still as bad as it was in those really dark days of 2023 and 2024?
The short answer is no. It's not as bad across the board, but it is definitely still an active shortage. If you look at the latest update from MedFinder, specifically for Adderall IR, that's the immediate release version, availability has improved globally, I should say nationally, but the spot shortages are really persistent. It's highly regional.
Okay, and we have some hard numbers on this, right? Because of that Reddit deep dive into the DEA's filings for this year.
Right, yeah. This is where we get into the weeds of the APQ, the aggregate production quota. Basically, the DEA sets a hard ceiling on how much amphetamine can be produced in the U.S. every single year. And the Reddit analysis of the final 2026 order actually shows some wins.
Okay, what kind of wins?
Well, the DEA raised the quota for d-amphetamine, that's the raw ingredient. They bumped it from about 21.2 million grams to roughly 26.5 million grams, which is a significant jump.
Okay, hold on, though, because I was looking at those numbers from the Reddit breakdown. And yeah, raising it to 26.5 million grams sounds like a huge win on paper. But I'm looking at the dates. The DEA finalized those numbers in January 2026.
I think I know exactly where you're going with this.
It's just math. Right? If the permission slip is signed in January, the factory doesn't just magically spit out millions of pills in February.
You have hit on the quota lag, and it is arguably the most frustrating part of this entire bureaucracy. You are looking at a 6-month delay, minimum.
6 months.
At least, because the DEA finalizes the numbers in January. Then manufacturers have to actually order the raw powder, which often comes from overseas. They have to ship it, process it, press the pills, package them, and distribute them to pharmacies. So the impact of that 2026 quota hike, you won't really feel it at the pharmacy counter until mid-2026.
So we are essentially in a waiting game. But looking at the Reddit thread, there was something else that really jumped out at me. The quota for lisdexamfetamine, which is Vivance, it went up huge.
Yeah, 22% boost. They raised the ceiling to over 51 million grams.
Which makes me think the government strategy here is to just shift people over. Like, if you can't get Adderall, they're essentially signaling for you to go try the generic Vivance.
Precisely. It's a pressure release valve. But here is where the Reddit investigation gets really fascinating and honestly a little controversial. They didn't just look at the total weight of the quotas, they dug into the isomer ratio.
Oh, I saw this. This is related to that massive complaint from the patient community that the generic medication feels wrong, or that it just doesn't work as well as it used to, right?
Exactly. Because Adderall is a very specific mix of amphetamine salts. And there is a strong belief right now among patients that the ratio of the D-isomer to the L-isomer has shifted in these generics.
Okay, for someone who isn't a chemist, can you explain the difference between those two, the right-hand and left-hand molecules?
Sure. They are mirror images of each other, but they do very different things to your body. The D-isomer is the one you actually want for ADHD. It hits the dopamine receptors in the brain. It gives you that mental clarity and focus.
And the Alzheimer.
That one hits the norepinephrine system. It creates what we call the body load. It raises your heart rate, gives you the sweats, makes you feel jittery and anxious.
Okay, so if a generic manufacturer messes up that ratio, like if they cheap out and let way too much of the isomer into the mix, you aren't just imagining that the meds feel dirty or rough. You are literally overdosing on the physical side effects while underdosing on the mental focus.
Exactly. It's a very real physical reaction. And the Reddit deep dive into the DEA filings revealed kind of a smoking gun here. The DEA explicitly responded to these patient concerns in their filing, and they basically said, we do not force a 1-to-1 ratio.
Wow.
Yeah. They treat amphetamine as amphetamine. They allocate the total volume of ingredients, but they stated it is entirely up to the manufacturers and the FDA to ensure the pill is formulated correctly.
So the DEA is just completely washing their hands of the quality control issue.
Pretty much. They are basically saying, look, we just set the speed limit on the highway. We do not build the cars. So they shifted all the blame for medication quality right back to the pharma companies.
Which is terrifying if you are a patient, because you are relying on a manufacturer to be perfectly ethical about a chemical ratio that isn't strictly enforced by the quota itself.
Right.
But let's zoom out a little bit, because even if the ratio is perfect, and even if the quota is finally raised, we still have empty pharmacy shelves today.
And that brings us to the supply chain. I was reading the report from the Global Women's Network, and they highlight something called API vulnerability.
Yes, the active pharmaceutical ingredient. We tend to think of the Adderall shortage as this strictly American paperwork issue, but the raw materials are part of a massive global supply chain.
So we aren't just talking about a pill-pressing factory in New Jersey. We are talking about where the actual chemical dust comes from.
Exactly. Think of it like baking a cake. You might have a great bakery in your town, but if the specific flour you need only comes from one tiny region in Asia, and that region experiences a drought or a shipping strike or a regulatory shutdown, your local bakery has to stop baking.
Even if there's a line out the door of people wanting to buy cake. Exactly. Most of these active ingredients come from a very small number of regions globally. And the Global Women's Network report makes it clear that this system is incredibly fragile. It is built for efficiency and cost saving. It is absolutely not built for resilience.
So a disruption in one tiny segment, like a shortage of a precursor chemical, used to make the API that ripples across entire continents.
It does. And then, assuming the drugs actually get manufactured and make it to the U.S., you hit the distribution bottleneck.
This is the part that drives me absolutely crazy. I have heard so many stories of people trying to change pharmacies, and the new pharmacy just turns them away. They say, we can't take you as a new patient.
It's an allocation problem, and it is based entirely on history. Drug distributors, the middlemen who ship to the pharmacies, they allocate pills based on what that specific pharmacy ordered last year.
Wait, so if my pharmacy closes and I move my prescription to the pharmacy down the street, that new pharmacy doesn't get an extra bottle for me?
Nope. They do not. They get what they historically got. So if they get a sudden influx of new ADHD patients or refugees from other pharmacies that ran dry, they have no way to accommodate them. It's a system that is fundamentally designed to prevent sudden spikes in orders which they view as a sign of drug diversion or black market selling.
But the result is it creates these pharmacy deserts.
Exactly. The supply exists in the country, but it's locked into historical routes. It isn't where the actual patients are today.
It really seems like the entire system is built on a foundation of deep suspicion. Like the default assumption from the top down is that everyone is trying to abuse these drugs, so we have to lock every single door.
That observation is spot on. And to understand why that suspicion is baked into the DNA of the system, we have to go back in time. We need to look at the first amphetamine epidemic.
This is the historical analysis from the PMC article. And honestly, reading this blew my mind, because I think most people assume ADHD meds are a relatively modern phenomenon. But this starts in the 1920s.
1929, to be exact. A biochemist named Gordon Alice was actually looking for a decongestant. He wanted something to clear up stuffy noses, and he synthesized amphetamine. By 1933, it was being sold commercially as the Benzedrine inhaler.
And this was completely over the counter, right? You could just walk in and buy it.
You could buy it at any drugstore, no prescription needed. And people figured out very quickly that if you cracked the plastic inhaler open, there was a folded piece of paper inside that was soaked in 250 milligrams of amphetamine base.
250 milligrams. That is a staggering amount. Just for context, a typical adult Adderall dose today might be 10 or 20 milligrams.
Right. People were ingesting massive, massive amounts. They were putting the paper in their coffee or chewing it. But the real explosion in use happened during World War II.
Military involvement.
Exactly. The U.S. military, and actually several other militaries, supplied Benzedrine to servicemen specifically to keep them awake and alert during combat.
So the government literally normalized it.
Completely. There's a fascinating prison study from 1945 mentioned in the source. They found that 25% of imprisoned military personnel were actively abusing these inhalers. But the kicker is that 27% of those abusers explicitly stated they had been introduced to the drug by the military.
Wow.
We essentially trained an entire generation of young men that this was a totally normal tool for performance and endurance.
And then the war ends and all those soldiers come home. What happens then?
Then you get the iatrogenic epidemic. Iatrogenic means doctor-caused. During the post-war boom, pharmaceutical companies went wild. They marketed amphetamines for literally everything.
Right. Feeling a little blue, taking amphetamine.
Exactly. Need to lose a few pounds. Amphetamine. Feeling mild neurosis. Amphetamine.
This was the whole Dr. Feelgood era.
It was. Dr. Max Jacobson is probably the most famous example from the text. He was a physician treating celebrities, socialites, but most famously, he was treating President JFK.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. Jacobson was routinely injecting the president with this custom mix of methamphetamine, vitamins, and hormones, and the stated goal was to maintain JFK's youthful vigor.
So the President of the United States was essentially on speed during the Cold War.
It was common practice among the elite, and it trickled down quickly. By 1970, the legal production of amphetamines in the U.S. was high enough to provide 50 doses for every single person in the country, man, woman, and child.
50 doses per person. That is an ocean of speed.
It was, and the government estimated that fully 50% of that legal supply was being reverted straight to the black market. People were hooked.
Okay, so knowing that history completely reframes the current DEA strictness, they aren't just being bureaucratic for the fun of it. They're reacting to a very real historical trauma, where we literally flooded the entire country with speed.
Exactly. The rigid quota system that is driving everyone crazy today, the Schedule II classification, it was a direct, panicked, legislative reaction to that uncontrolled epidemic of the late 1960s. They were desperately trying to put the genie back in the bottle.
And that effort wasn't just domestic. It went global. Which brings us to the Wikipedia source on the 1971 convention.
The Convention on Psychotropic Substances. This is a brilliant piece of geopolitical drama. In 1971, the UN finally stepped in to coordinate a global response. But there was a massive conflict of interest at the table.
Between the countries growing the drugs and the countries making the drugs.
Precisely. Developing nations, mostly in South America and Asia, were producing organic drugs. Opium, coca leaf. They wanted extremely strict international rules on synthetic drugs because the synthetics were directly competing with their agricultural exports.
In the developed nations.
The U.S. and Europe had these massive pharmaceutical industries making billions off these synthetic pills, so they actually lobbied hard to keep the rules weaker for their profitable pills while simultaneously pushing to crack down on the organic drugs from the developing world.
It is always about the money.
Always. But eventually, the public health crisis in the West became so undeniable that they had to compromise. And that agreement created the schedule system we use today.
Right, this is where Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 come from.
Yes, Schedule 1 is for drugs with supposedly no medical use and high abuse potential, like LSD or MDMA. Schedule 2 recognizes that a drug has legitimate medical use, but acknowledges a severe potential for addiction and abuse. That is where Adderall and Ritalin landed.
And the treaty fundamentally changed how these drugs cross borders, right?
It locked down the global supply chain. The treaty requires strict government-to-government authorization for any imports or exports of Schedule II substances. You cannot just ship a barrel of amphetamine precursor across a border because there's market demand. Every single gram has to be applied for, justified, and accounted for by federal agencies. It made the supply chain incredibly rigid by design.
So we have this massive global supply chain designed in 1971 specifically to stop a widespread abuse epidemic. But fast forward to today, in 2026, we have a massive, legitimate treatment demand. How are these two things colliding right now?
It is a head-on collision. And the Global Women's Network report really grounds this in the human cost of that mismatch. We aren't dealing with a generation of people trying to get high to go to a disco. We are dealing with what the report calls functioning decline.
The stories in that report are just heartbreaking. You have seasoned professionals losing their jobs because they suddenly can't focus on their screens. You have children failing out of school almost overnight simply because their local pharmacy shelf is empty.
And that sheer desperation leads to the absolute darkest side of this shortage, which is the counterfeit market. The MedFinder updates note that when the legitimate supply dries up, the black market doesn't hesitate to fill the void.
But in 2026, the black market isn't just selling a few extra diverted pills from someone's prescription.
No, they are selling fakes. They were pressing counterfeit pills to look exactly like a 20-milligram Adderall, right down to the scoring and the stamped numbers, but they are laced with illicit methamphetamine or, far worse, fentanyl.
So the quota system, which is supposed to protect people from harm, is inadvertently driving desperate patients toward unregulated, potentially lethal alternatives just so they can maintain their employment.
That is the tragic irony of it, and we have to acknowledge that telehealth plays a really complicated role here, too.
Telehealth was kind of a double-edged sword for this, wasn't it?
It really was. On one hand, telehealth expanded access to psychiatric diagnosis incredibly fast, which is a massive win for health equity. Millions of people who lived in rural areas or couldn't afford traditional specialists finally got the help they needed.
But the system wasn't ready for them.
Exactly. Prescription volumes skyrocketed overnight. It completely outpaced that rigid quota system we just talked about. The regulatory machinery of the DEA moves at the speed of 1970s paperwork, while patient demand is now moving at the speed of a smartphone app.
It really feels like we are stuck in a bureaucratic trap. So for the listener who is struggling right now, who is listening to this while driving to their fourth pharmacy of the day, what are the actual takeaways? What can they proactively do?
Based on the combined advice from MedFinder and the patient communities on Reddit, there are a few tactical moves you can make. First, try to start relying entirely on the massive retail pharmacy chains.
Because of that historical allocation problem.
Right. Independent, family-owned pharmacies often have more flexibility. They use different distributors. They aren't bound by the same rigid corporate algorithms. And honestly, they are just more likely to actually answer the phone when you call to check stock.
That makes a lot of sense.
Second, you need to talk to your doctor about dose flexibility. If you typically take a 20-milligram pill and it's back-ordered for a month, see if your doctor can write a new prescription for 2 10-milligram pills or some other combination. The spot shortages are heavily concentrated on the most popular pill sizes.
And we can't forget the Vyvanse update from the DEA.
Right. With that 22% quota increase for lisdexamfetamine for 2026, generic Vyvanse is positioned to be the most reliable option on the market this year. If your insurance covers it and it works for your body, it is absolutely worth having a conversation with your prescriber about switching over.
So as we wrap this deep dive up, I think we really need to zoom out and look at the big picture. We have built a system that is fundamentally at odds with itself.
We really have. We are completely trapped between are we protecting patients from addiction, or are we just punishing them for the sins of the past?
And it leaves me with one final thought, something to really chew on that wasn't directly in the reports but feels so relevant. These treaties and quotas from 1971 assume that human demand is static. But human lives are incredibly dynamic. The modern world demands a level of sustained, unbroken mental focus from average workers that didn't even exist 50 years ago.
That is so true.
So what if the real side effect of the 1971 convention isn't just the pharmacy shortage? What if the real side effect is that it forces us to treat human focus as a strictly rationed state resource? Imagine if the government told you they couldn't fill your glasses prescription because your zip code had reached its annual limit for clear vision.
That is a terrifying thought. But it is exactly what it feels like.
It is something to think about the next time you are on hold with the pharmacy. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me. Take care, everyone.